As Bob said, my name is Rob Leyden, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the third Chatham Marconi Speaker Series presentation of 2024. Tonight's program, the Jones Act, will explore the impact of laws designed to protect American sailors and the American merchant marine industry, but also that had an unintended negative impact on the merchant fleet. Around the time that Marconi saved Titanic survivors, his ship-to-shore transmissions reached few U.S. flagships. There were only 7 engaged in international trade at that time, but in the build-up to World War I and after, the U.S. had a glut of ships. The result was the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, better known as the Jones Act, defining U.S. commercial maritime policy and seafarer safety with the goal of encouraging a robust U.S. flag merchant marine, and remains controlling law over 100 years later. Since World War II, however, the act has backfired, at least as concerns U.S. flag international shipping. The combination of the world's #1 most protectionist shipping legislation and #1 most generous seafarer personal injury remedy has sunk our merchant marine so thoroughly that U.S. flagships now carry only 1.5% of oceanic imports and exports to the country. The size of the merchant marine fleet has been dramatically reduced, and we rely on other nations' ships to carry our international imports and exports. This has led to high costs for imported goods, contributed directly to the pandemic's supply chain crisis. Furthermore, having no U.S. international commercial fleet leads to some serious national security issues, such as the U.S. Navy being tasked to attack Yemen's Houthis rebels to safeguard other nations' ships halfway around the world. Closer to home, the Jones Act is actively impeding construction of offshore wind farms by preventing the use of uniquely specialized wind turbine construction vessels. Is there a practical solution for us? David Farrell, Jr., an expert in Admiralty and Maritime Law and immediate past president of the Maritime Law Association of the United States, is going to discuss his research into the Jones Act, possible remedies for the problems besetting the U.S. maritime industry and the nation. Following his presentation, Dave will answer your questions, and on your computer, enter your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and typing them in. I'll screen the questions and relay them to Dave. Similar questions may be combined to avoid repetition. It is now my pleasure to introduce David Farrell, Jr.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Very nice. Thank you all so much for turning out on this dank evening. Just, take to heart, it's only 3 more months of this. I know that you want to get home and watch the State of the Union. I have no doubt that you'll be there in time, as long as my supporters do not stand up and give me a standing ovation after every sentence. We'll try and move it along a little bit. And I realize there are detractors out there that will heckle me, but that's okay. I've been heckled by federal judges for 40 years in mid-sentence, and I will try and show that I still have my faculties if you try. I sure we'll have time at the end for a discussion. We're going to be talking about the Jones Act, which is 2 parts. Both have sunk each other. We're going to be talking about ships that fly the U.S. flag. We're going to be talking about the merchant marine, the commercial sailors who sail cargo ships, and the United States Navy, which traditionally has protected them. But there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. The merchant marine, you'll remember in World War II, was instrumental in getting goods across to Europe. And it's still the case that whenever we have foreign engagements, the Military Sealift Command, which is operated by the Maritime Administration, a wing of the Department of Transportation, has a bunch of ships that provide cargo, food, hospital supplies, jeeps, tanks, armaments to our troops overseas, and they're operated not by Navy officers, but by our merchant mariners. I'm going to be talking about the Jones Act law. I'm not going to delve into it too much. I'll try and go through it quickly. We'll then be talking about the history that led up to the Jones Act so that you can see not just the development, but how it helps inform the policy backfires that are occurring today. We'll look at those ramifications and perhaps some solutions at the end. This is the preamble to the Jones Act. It was written by Congressman William Stedman Green of Fall River. And it is intended to promote and maintain our merchant marine, not only for commercial uses, but also for national defense. It's supposed to have the best equipped ships, sufficient to carry the greater portion of our international and domestic cargo. Owned and operated privately by citizens of the United States, and all this is declared as policy of the United States to do whatever is necessary to achieve these goals. We'll see if they have been. The first prong of the Jones Act is the cabotage provisions. Cabotage is a French, Spanish word meaning sailing cape to cape along the coasts. Domestic movement of cargo from one port in the United States, New York to Savannah, for instance. All countries have this kind of law in some form or another. Ours was quite enhanced by the Jones Act. We have one on the books going back to 1789. But this one has been beefed up a little bit. And it requires for goods to be moved in the domestic cargo industry on only U.S. built ships that are owned by U.S. companies and citizens, going back down to the shareholder level, and run by U.S. crew. Those are the three important parts of the Jones Act cabotage provisions: U.S. built, U.S. owned, and U.S. operated. The other section of the Jones Act is protection of seafarers by way of a pretty radical remedy for 1920. An injured seafarer, and I'm going to use the word seafarer particularly in honor of tomorrow's International Women's Day, but certainly in the 40 years that I have practiced, there have been women seafarers, and it goes back a little bit before that too. But seamen is still on the books and still in recent Supreme Court cases. We'll go with seafarers tonight. Anyone who's injured or dies in the course of ship work can bring a claim against the employer for negligence in front of a jury. Now think about that. If you were to fall at work and hurt your back, you would have a workers' compensation claim. You would not be able to sue your employer in front of a jury for who knows how big the award might be. There's a scheme set out in all states for almost all other workers, whether you're a construction worker or a lumberjack or a coal miner. All these dangerous jobs are covered by workers' compensation schemes. And you don't get the big bucks of a jury award, but you get taken care of immediately with your medical bills and a percentage of your salary so you can get back on your feet and back to work. That's not the case for seafarers. They can go for a casino type award with the jury. And interestingly, railroad employee law is what applies. And we'll see why. Anyway, as Rob mentioned, these are the two strongest provisions of their type in the entire world. So we get 2 gold medals. However, our fleet comes in 22nd place in the world. We have the 22nd largest fleet in the entire globe, and that's pathetic. And I submit that it's because of these 2 very strong provisions that deflate each other. They're mutually self-destructive. The cabotage provisions have made operating ships in this country so expensive that there are really not many mariners left. And the personal injury section of the Jones Act has sent insurance rates so high that insurers are pulling out. The expenses for this absorbed by ship owners is so big that they are moving their investments overseas to other countries' ships and not even bother putting them into Jones Act vessels. So we'll see how bad it has become later on. I do want to distinguish the abject failure on the international realm, the carriage of exports and imports into our country, from very robust segments of the coastwise trade, which have done very well under the protection of cabotage statutes. And we'll be looking at those 2 different aspects of the maritime industry. But a little history here, and it all sort of starts off with your namesake and the Titanic sinking. Here, Signor Guglielmo had his Marconi wireless transmitters on the Titanic and was able to communicate with the Carpathia 58 miles away. And had that not happened, the survivors probably would have been in the single digits, or whatever it is, the people that made it into the life rafts, the lifeboats. After the Titanic, there were some important safety improvements. Number of lifeboats on vessels were increased. Sailors were no longer flogged. If a crew faced a particularly despotic captain, they wouldn't be imprisoned if they deserted the ship. But when you get to about 1917 and the start of World War I, very few of American ships would have heard Marconi's transmissions because, as Rob said, we only had 7 in our international trade. We had completely outsourced the import and export of our cargo to Germany and to England. And when the 2 belligerents got fighting, there was no service to the United States. We were abandoned as a big island between the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast with no ships at all. Only 2% of our international cargo was carried on those 7 ships. So the Wilson administration ramped up very dramatically and aggressively a shipbuilding program as prepared to enter World War I. Shipyards like Hog Island in Philadelphia, Skinner and Eddy in Seattle, and the Quincy Shipyard in Massachusetts turned out a huge number of ships in a very short time. Also, the government was empowered to requisition, actually seize and own any foreign ships that happened to be in our waters. And what that meant was German ships and other vessels built in other lands could be used in our domestic trade, so they abandoned the cabotage protection during World War I. Joseph P. Kennedy was the assistant general manager up in Quincy. And he actually did a pretty good job. He really turned out an awful lot of ships. He met FDR on this job, and in 1937 he got appointed to the Federal Maritime Commission, and then the next year he was ambassador to England. But he's not really your typical shipyard worker. That was more like my grandfather. And after this very short World War I, it only lasted 19 months. I mean, think of what we've been in the last couple of decades. The shipbuilding effort produced 2,318 ocean-going vessels. A lot of those weren't quite finished. They were still up on the ways, but they were all owned by the federal government. And the federal government after World War I really didn't want to have anything to do with them. So the general consensus was that this 10 million tons of ships ought to be sold on the private market to individual US companies as a pump priming of our merchant marine so that we could carry our own goods to and fro. And in comes the namesake, Senator Jones from the eastern part of Washington. Some scholars say that he just really slapped together this legislation and there was no real foresight into it at all. Others point out that he hated everybody that didn't look like himself, particularly Native Americans and Aleuts. But there is, despite his old vision, some forward-looking vision, at least as far as commerce goes. In order to keep shipyards happy and to keep labor happy, we had to get these ships sold and operated. And he had said at the time of the passage of the Jones Act some very forward-thinking comments. I'll read them to you. And this is the first statement of multimodalism that we still have today. Containers on trucks and on trains being brought right down to the ships and loaded on them. The container revolution, which is something that almost all of our cargo moves in today. He says that not only should our railroads and internal waterways be most closely connected, but our railroads and overseas shipping lines should be brought into the closest cooperation. Our railroads should, as nearly as possible, be continued across the seas to foreign markets. I mean, this was a guy from eastern Washington, which is really still the Wild West in 1920, a place where there's ranchers and agricultural interests. They got to get their goods over the Cascades by train to Seattle or down the Columbia River to Portland. And this guy, had some forward thinking on that. He also, Una, in thinking about the supply chain snag that you caused during the pandemic, said, congestion at our principal ports will be greatly relieved, if not entirely averted, if business that is naturally tributary to certain ports comes to those ports to be handled. Improved terminal facilities and methods of handling products, whether for import or export, are greatly needed. And that's so true still today. But he had another problem, and that was labor. And don't forget, this is the progressive era. In the center of this photograph is Senator Bob La Follette from Wisconsin. He's got his arm around Lincoln Steffens, who was the muckraking journalist. And they were very involved in workers' rights during the early 1900s. The first immersion of it came with the railroad workers. They saw themselves as soldiers of capitalism. They were risking their lives in these very dangerous operations, building trestles across canyons, drilling holes through mountains, riding locomotives that would blow up and maim and kill them. And they wanted to have some sort of recovery from the railroads, which everybody hated. They all hated the robber barons. The trust busters, the muckrakers, and even the public didn't like the freight rates that they were being charged. They were exorbitant. So there was this unified approach in Congress to stick it to the railroads, and they came up with this idea to allow a negligence cause of action in front of a jury. And I mean, that was radical. That's the first time anything like that had happened. It was viewed as somewhat unsustainable because other industries were left with workers' compensation schemes as outlined by various states. But the seafarers were left very much behind. They didn't organize, they were at sea. They didn't have anybody that really took them under their wing until the guy on the left came along. A crusty old Norwegian immigrant seafarer named Andrew Furuset. He's referred to as the Abe Lincoln of the sea because he emancipated the seafarers. And his safety improvements through the years really made seafaring life much safer. But in 1919 and 1920, there were a lot of strikes. Remember the Red Scare and the fear that Bolshevism would take over in the United States. I mean, there's an awful lot of people gathered there. I'm sure they all got influenza too. It was a tough time for business and labor, in order to sell these ships, there needed to be some cooperation with seafarers, there was basically a management labor deal struck that in order to get the cabotage and the protection of U.S. shipping through Congress, they needed to appease the seafarers and come up with some sort of remedy for their personal injuries, because they really had very, very skimpy remedies if they were to get hurt. And they adopted the railroad workers remedy, giving the jury a negligence cause of action to seafarers. But over time, the seafarers did even better than the railroad workers. The Supreme Court instituted a cause of action called unseaworthiness, meaning that if you were hurt by a physical problem on board the ship, you almost had a strict liability recovery. It was an automatic recovery if you were injured by something that was unseaworthy. And that too could be brought in front of the jury, along with the old-fashioned maintenance and cure remedy, which meant you get your medical bills paid for and a very small daily stipend. But this is a quiver full of 3 arrows that all could be aimed at the employer in front of a jury. And the result was tremendous recoveries for seafarers and a tremendous increase in insurance rates over the years. My friend, Professor Michael Sturley at the University of Texas writes, "The Jones Act, unseaworthiness, and maintenance and cure causes of action make the seaman the most generously treated personal injury victim in American law." And it's indeed the most generous recovery in the whole world. And what this has done to U.S. flag shipping is nothing good. You can see in the blue line the decline in the number of ships in the last 70 years. Now there is the brown line, which shows an increase in deadweight tonnage during the 70s, and that was for big tankers that they built to carry Prudhoe Bay crude down to the West Coast. And you might look at that and say, well, look, the deadweight tonnage is pretty much the same at the beginning of the end, so what are you complaining about, Farrell? And I say, forget it, look at the blue line and realize that our gross domestic product increased tenfold over this period, making this decrease in the number of ships even more dramatic. And one of the reasons is that building a ship in the United States is 5 times more expensive than building one in Southeast Asia. Another reason is it's 4 times as expensive to run a ship in the United States with U.S. crew wages, with U.S. crew insurance rates, and taxes and all the other things that go into operating a ship. So instead of putting money into U.S. flagships, investors in the United States that want to get into shipping have put their money into foreign registries, meaning they flag their ships under other countries' laws. You've seen Panama ships, Liberian ships. Some of those are really American money behind them. Bahamas has a registry, and a very big one is the Marshall Islands Registry. It operates out of a little atoll in the middle of the Pacific, and it has all sorts of ships under its registry. That's where our ships have gone. And this is another graph. It's a little bit like apples and oranges compared to the last graph, but look at the blue line. This covers 60 years. It doesn't include only U.S. Jones Act ocean-going vessels. It also includes the military Sea Lift Command vessels, which supply our troops. And it also is bookended by kind of the old Cold War and our current Cold War. And look at the number of ships that we now have, and look at that precipitous decline from 2,900 in 1960 to 169 ships as of 2018. And at the same time, if you look at the red line, the world shipping has gone from a total of 17,000 up to 41,000, meaning that the United States has 0.4% of the world's ships. It's just like before World War I. We're an island that is not served by our own ships. In fact, only 1.5% of our ocean-going cargo, not the Great Lakes, not from Mexico, but the imports and exports that we rely on for our economy, 1.5% of that is carried on U.S. flagged vessels. It's a very dangerous position for our economy. Any one of these nations could decide to stop serving the United States. Maersk, Costco, China Ocean Shipping Company. If Costco decides for whatever reason to not bring any goods and embargo us, what are we going to do? We can't go get them. It's very, very dangerous commercially, and it's also very dangerous from a national security point of view, because we don't have as many of those ships that carry the cargo, the tanks, the jeeps, the hospital supplies, the food for our troops. These are old ships, and they don't have many mariners that can run them. In fact, the studies show that we could only use the military Sea Lift Command to supply our troops for about 6 months. It's a very dangerous situation in what could be considered a very dangerous world that we live in today. And one of the danger spots, and I find this really intriguing, is the Houthi rebels. We don't have any U.S. flags going through the Red Sea. We don't have any U.S. mariners sailing through the Red Sea. I mean, Denmark has sent its air force consisting of one jet. India has one vessel. It's all up to the UK and the United States to protect the freedom of navigation where we don't have any ships. Now, granted, maybe some of the cargo on these ships is bound for the United States, and I suppose there's an argument that we have an interest in protecting that. But there was a headline a couple weeks ago about U.S.-owned ship attacked by Houthi rebels. Well, it wasn't a U.S. flagship. It was a Marshall Islands ship. It wasn't built in the United States to help our economy. It isn't crewed by United States citizen seafarers. It doesn't pay U.S. taxes, and yet they get the benefit of naval protection. I don't think this has been called out in the media, and I think I just think it's a fascinating problem. I don't know what we're doing. Shifting gears a little bit domestically. On the right side, there's a Crowley tug, and Crowley is a very successful company operating on all three of our coasts. They move goods up and back to Alaska, to Puerto Rico. They're going to be involved in wind farm work, and they're a very strong company and a very strong advocate for the Jones Act. This is a photo that my son took at a San Diego shipyard where he works or worked. He got his start at Chatham Yacht Basin. As did I when it was Eldridge Marine in 1972. He was at this time an underwater welder, and I'm very glad he's no longer doing that dangerous job. That's a good way to get electrocuted. But he's now moved up into a Navy subcontractor and is getting sent to business school, which I think is much safer. But he tells the story of the feather bedding at the shipyards and how atrocious it is. The crane on the left, they had a guy that worked at the shipyard for 30 years whose only job was to unscrew the pin of a shackle, put on the load, screw it back in. They'd lift it, they'd move it to where it was going to go. He'd go back on the ship, he'd unscrew the shackle, and then he'd put the pin back in and screw it back in. That's all he did. No wonder it's 5 times more expensive to build a ship in the United States. And it's just last week we had the Secretary of the Navy inviting Korea shipbuilders to come here and tell American shipbuilders how better to do their job. The technology and innovation that is going on in South Korea is leaps and bounds ahead of the backward the shipbuilding industry in the United States. The Jones Act has been criticized by free market economists over the years. Senator John McCain was the leading spokesman. The argument is that without any foreign shipping serving Alaska, the private domestic companies that do go up there are able to charge very high freight rates, and that makes living in Alaska very expensive. It's probably expensive to live in Alaska anyway. Hawaiians have the same gripe. Let's say that a Costco ship from China wanted to get goods to Honolulu. So they'd sail from Shanghai, but they'd have to bypass Honolulu. They'd have to go to Long Beach, California, and offload the goods. Then they'd be put on a Matson ship and taken back to Honolulu. That really does add the expenses to Hawaiian living. Maybe that's what you get when you're the 50th state. Puerto Rico has basically the same problem. And the argument is that the Jones Act is a very important factor in poverty in Puerto Rico. That the rates are that the expenses of getting goods there is just way more expensive than it needs to be. That basically companies like Tote or Crowley have a monopoly in bringing goods and services to Puerto Rico. This is the El Faro, tote ship. It sank in a hurricane, 33 deaths. You have to wonder. I mean, it shouldn't have sunk in the hurricane. It had serious equipment problems, engine room problems, boiler problems. It's an old ship, and you have to wonder whether Congressman Green's preamble that American shipping be the best equipped has been satisfied. It's a tragedy that didn't need to happen. Another strong advocate for the Jones Act is the tug and barge industry. There are 40,000 tugs and barges in the United States. Huge number, of course, in the Mississippi and Ohio River. They carry everything from gravel to soybeans to ship assists. The American Waterway Operators is their lobbying arm. They claim that 650,000 people are employed in this industry. They're not mariners, but shoreside support too. And they claim to pump $150 billion into the economy. I don't know if that's inflated or not, but they certainly have the ear of Congress. The Jones Act has strong support. It's bipartisan. Both parties come out in favor of the Jones Act routinely, and most presidential administrations do too. Even closer to home, here's Chatham's Godfrey Windmill at Chase Park. Growing up, I knew this was the windiest place in America. And this chart showing the shallow continental shelf south of Nantucket, Vineyard Wind, the Block Island 5-tower wind farm that's operating now, along to the south of Long Island over to the intersection in New York and New Jersey called the New York Bight. That whole area north of the Ambrose-Nantucket shipping lane is known as the Saudi Arabia of wind. It's largely untapped. I hope it is during my career. It's been faced with some problems, as you probably have read. Utilities are pulling out because rates are too high. Investors, supply chain snags, and inflation have all caused contracts to be voided and renegotiated. And things have not built up quite as quickly as we expected. If there is a new administration that is against renewable energy, I think there'll be another delay. But at some point, I think these wind farms are going to spring up because they're so close to the urban centers. But another problem that hasn't been mentioned in the media is the Jones Act. And here we have a WTIV, a wind turbine installation vessel. You see it's jacked up. It's a vessel, but it has these spuds that allow it to get up off the surface of the water to install the towers. But it's not a Jones Act vessel, and it's handcuffed in what it can do. It can't go back into New Bedford and get more towers to bring back out, because that would be moving merchandise from one point in the United States to another point in the United States, and that's prohibited by the Jones Act. So there has to be this added layer of bringing equipment out in a U.S. barge to the WTIV so that it then can do the work, and that's an inefficiency. Cable layers. All these towers need to be connected by cables. We don't have any in the United States. Another Jones Act problem is each of these towers has what's called scour protection at the bottom, a rock kind of erosion prevention that is dumped by a very specialized vessel. We don't have any of them. Actually, one's being built, but mostly it's foreign flag vessels that do this. They can't even go into New Bedford and get a shipment of rocks. Most of the rocks are coming from Canada and then dumped on our soil. There is a WTIV that's being built for I don't know how many billions of dollars down in Brownsville, Texas now. But until we get a fleet that can handle this sort of work more efficiently, I think there is another impediment to wind farms taking off. So looking to the future, actually we have to look at the past first. I mean, maritime law goes back to the Phoenicians. It's the first body of law that we ever had, and it's evolved every couple hundred years to take account of developments. It's actually the foundation for emerging space law. The Elon Musk's and the Jeffrey Bezos's rockets are going to be taking off from barges with cargo. I assume they're going to end up picking up things in space and bringing it back to the United States. That will be moving merchandise from one point in the United States to another point in the United States and governed by the Jones Act. I don't know that we can keep up with the Jones Act, or that the Jones Act can keep up with us. I'm not sure really that there's much hope in getting amendments to the Jones Act. There's certainly very strong lobbying efforts that support the Jones Act. Cabotage protection for our domestic fleet is extremely strong, and it's always difficult to get anything through Congress given the discord that there is. I really think that seafarer injury remedies ought to be covered by workers' comp. That would help on the insurance costs. But the House of Representatives is mostly comprised of personal injury plaintiffs' lawyers, and they're not going to do it. So I'm not sure that there's much tinkering with the Jones Act that will be effective. Labor is an issue. Shipyard labor can certainly be made more efficient, and robotics might be the answer. A robotic welder can do a better job and faster than a guy wearing a hard hat. That would certainly make production of ships more efficient and cheaper. Maritime automated surface ships. That's the autonomous vessels that you hear about. It's going to be run by AI. Eventually, we're not going to need Jon Zack seafarers. It's all going to be done by computers. That would cut down on marine insurance costs. But this sort of tinkering, I'm not sure is going to answer the bigger question of whether it's time for our island nation to take a close look at the maritime policy that was developed in 1920 and whether it can still be applied in an even more interconnected world. So, I thank you, and I'm happy to entertain questions or anything.
Okay, just a reminder that asking questions are easy. Just click on the Q&A if you're at home at the bottom of the screen and type the question, and we'll relay it to David. Anything here in the audience that you'd like to answer? Sure, go ahead.
So, people in Hawaii and Alaska, because they're part of the United States, they have to do this switching back and forth because of the Jones Act. Is that correct?
It really, it is. Now, a foreign ship, do you
Yeah,
want to repeat it?
Let me repeat the
Yeah.
question. So the question was, so the Jones Act then affects freight that is going between continental United States and Alaska, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico are the three examples. A foreign ship could take goods and drop them off at Alaska or Puerto Rico or Honolulu. That's fine. What they can't do is move cargo between Seattle and Anchorage or from Jacksonville to Puerto Rico. That has to be done on a U.S. flagged vessel. And that adds to the expenses of living in these outlying areas.
So if you start in the United States and you end in the United States, it has to be a Jones Act vessel.
Yes, the definition in the statute is the movement of any merchandise by land or sea from one point in the United States to another point in the United States must be carried on a U.S. flagged vessel, one that's U.S. built, one that's U.S. owned, and one that's U.S. operated by seafarers.
Okay, I don't see any questions at the other end. Yes.
Yes, please.
It's robotics. Are there any shipyards that are starting to use robotics at all that you know of?
Okay, the question is, are any shipyards using robotics today?
In the United States, I'm not aware of any.
And overseas?
Yes, yeah. South Korea has a lot of robotics.
So that's why they were bringing the South Korea.
That's why that's right. That's why the Navy Secretary wanted to get some of their input. Yes, Andy?
Our maritime academies, the young men and women that go through the maritime academies, are they then mostly employed under foreign flag by companies?
So the question is, if who are our graduates from the various merchant marine academies then employed mostly by foreign flag carriers?
No, they get jobs in the United States. They get jobs on big Jones Act tankers and cargo ships with Crowleys. Crowley's a big sponsor of Mass Maritime, for instance. A lot of them end up as tug captains or ferry boat captains in Alaska. But when you drill down a little bit at a place like Mass Maritime, which touts its high employment rate for graduates, you see that a lot of those people also end up as they're engineers, but they also work for water treatment plants and onshore in non-maritime capacities. So it's, the classes aren't that big. There's only a few maritime academies. I think they're trying to feed the U.S. needs, but the U.S. needs are greater than the academies can provide.
We have a few questions that have come in from home. In no particular order, have exceptions ever been made for shipbuilding outside the U.S. over the years?
For Jones Act vessels, the answer is no. There are government-owned vessels that were not built in the United States that are being used now. A lot of the military Sea Lift Command vessels are foreign vessels that have been converted. But the Jones Act itself, as far as carrying domestic cargo in our coastwise trade, is strictly required to be a U.S.-built vessel.
Mark Pachuzzi asks, what is the effect of Jones Act on passenger ships?
The Jones Act has a parallel statute which is almost identical. It's called the Passenger Vessel Act. And it's also a requirement that vessels carrying passengers between two U.S. points must be built in the United States, must be owned by U.S. corporation and shareholders, and must be operated by U.S. seafarers. It's almost the identical statute. I haven't gone into it, but as Rob was saying before today's talk, he took a trip from Hawaii down to...
Yeah, it was a Fanning Island in Kiribati.
Yeah, a 1,200-mile trip, but he wasn't able to take it on a...
On a U.S. flag carrier. It was Holland America.
Yeah. U.S. flag vessels don't exist for a lot of these routes.
Yep.
You know, any ferry boat, say from Seattle, there's an Alaska Marine Ferries operation that runs from Seattle up to Alaska. That is all U.S. built, owned, and crewed.
Let's see. How many shipbuilding facilities are active in the United States?
I don't have a real good number on that. I can tell you the ones that I know are big. There's a whole bunch of them down in the Gulf, Mississippi and Avondale.
Pascagoula?
Yeah, right. There's also a big operation in Mobile by Austell. Mm-hmm. There's Philadelphia. There's Boston Shipyard. There's one in Norfolk. There's Bath Iron Works in Maine. And then there's NASCO in San Diego. And there's a couple of big ones in Portland and in Seattle. There's one in the Great Lakes too, Fincantieri. Right.
Okay. The only ones I know are military ones like Portsmouth and Newport News and Electric Boat.
And these are all, the ones I was talking about they do commercial construction, but they also will do Navy ship repair.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. There's a question about the impact of the Jones Act on Cape Cod fishermen. Can you talk about how the local fishermen, local fish industry was affected by the Jones Act?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can give you a pretty simple answer. Fishermen and fisherwomen, fishers, are all Jones Act seafarers. And so their remedy against the owner of the fish boat, if they get hurt, is a jury trial for negligence and unseaworthiness. And the awards can be pretty dramatic.
So that raises insurance costs.
It raises insurance costs, and it raises your scallop costs.
Okay.
But if you were working on a boat that was a Novi-built boat.
A what? A Novi?
A Novi-built.
Right. You're still a Jones Act seafarer. That's in the town of Chatham. There's been historical debate about that. There was a former assistant harbor master who ratted out some of the Novi boats as not being built in the United States, and he was run out of not out of town. He was run out of state.
You were asked to elaborate on the security position we've created by starving the shipbuilding capability, both with respect to commercial vessels and, more importantly, the naval fleet.
I missed the beginning question.
Okay. They would like the requester would like you to elaborate on the security position we've created by starving the shipbuilding capability, both with respect to commercial vessels and, more importantly, the naval fleet.
I'm not focused on the naval fleet in my research.
Does the Jones Act affect the naval fleet?
It affects it indirectly by the Military Sea Lift Command, I think, is the answer. The support and supply of the naval fleet and all of our troops is done by Jon Zack Seafarers operating the Military Sea Lift Command vessels.
I see.
Whether our naval fleet is up to the task is something I'm not really focused on.
Does the Jones Act have any impact, for example, on, let's say, a submarine that's built by electric boat?
No, a submarine is a military vessel operated by naval officers, and so it doesn't have Jones Act implications. Really, Jones Act is a commercial statute, but it has national security ramifications.
Yes.
Gives you another thing to worry about.
It does. It really does. So the two things with the security issues and the pandemic supply chain issues, is anybody, other than your talk, is anybody doing anything about this?
Okay, so the question is this something that Congress or anyone else is actually taking up and trying to change?
It's pretty grim. There was a So there was a news article, a congressman from Wisconsin who chairs the U.S. U.S. Subcommittee on Communism. I didn't know there was one still, but it came out just a few weeks ago and was questioning the lack of military sea lift command capacity that we have. Because it is, as you know, because we're actually in another Cold War, and need to have a support system for our troops if we get embroiled overseas.
Do we have any strong voices lobbying to change the Jones Act at all?
You know, there was like Senator McCain, but he's no longer with us. You know, there's a few conservative Republicans, but no, I don't think there really is any strong congressional advocate for getting rid of it, because they all get money from the domestic companies that are doing so well under the Jones Act, and it's just a question of lobbying.
Okay. Anything else? Well, I want to thank you, Dave, for coming tonight and speaking to us. We have for you this priceless Chatham Marconi ball cap.
Nice.
And a membership for you for Chatham Marconi. And we appreciate the...
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.